Good afternoon, everyone. To begin, I'd like to say a few words about Paul Volcker, who, as you know, passed away earlier this week. Paul Volcker served as Federal Reserve Chair from 1979 to 1987. He accomplished many things during his long and distinguished career at the Fed and elsewhere. Of course, he's best known for leading the fight to tame the double-digit inflation that he inherited as chair, thus laying the foundation for the prosperity and price stability we enjoy today. But what is perhaps most admirable about him, more than his many accomplishments, was his character. He believed that there is no higher calling than public service, and he dedicated the lion's share of his life to it. With courage, integrity, and tenacity, he always pursued the policies that he believed would ultimately benefit all Americans. My colleagues and I continue to draw inspiration from his example. Turning to today's meeting, my colleagues and I decided to leave our policy rate unchanged after lowering it a total of 0.75 percentage point at the previous 3 meetings. As always, we base our decisions on judgment of how best to achieve the goals Congress has given us: maximum employment and price stability. Our economic outlook remains a favorable one, despite global developments and ongoing risks. With our decisions through the course of the past year, we believe that monetary policy is well positioned to serve the American people by supporting continued economic growth, a strong job market, and inflation near our symmetric 2% goal. The economic expansion is in its 11th year, the longest on record. Household spending has been strong, supported by a healthy job market, rising incomes, and solid consumer confidence. In contrast, business investment and exports remain weak, and manufacturing output has declined over the past year. As has been the case for some time, sluggish growth abroad and trade developments have been weighing on those sectors. Even so, the overall economy has been growing moderately. And with a strong household sector and supportive monetary and financial conditions, we expect moderate growth to continue.